It all started on a quiet morning in a small town, where life seemed ordinary, almost predictable. But sometimes, life has a way of throwing us into extraordinary situations when we least expect it. This is the story of a man and his loyal dog, bound not just by companionship but by a journey that would change them forever. A journey filled with challenges, surprises, and lessons neither of them saw coming. The man wasn't anyone famous, nor did he live an extraordinary life before this. He was someone who found joy in the little things: morning coffee, long walks in the park, and the simple pleasure of tossing a ball for his four-legged friend. His dog, a shaggy, energetic mix with big, soulful eyes, was more than just a pet. They were partners in life, inseparable through every twist and turn. For years, their lives had been routine. The dog's wagging tail greeted him every morning, and their evenings were spent exploring trails near their home. Life was good, peaceful even. But one day, something shifted. It began with a small, seemingly inconsequential moment. During one of their usual walks, the dog suddenly froze mid-step, staring into the woods. His ears perked up, and a low, curious growl escaped his throat. The man tugged gently on the leash, but the dog wouldn't budge. It wasn't fear that held him still, it was something else, something the man couldn't quite put his finger on. "Come on, buddy," he coaxed, but the dog's gaze remained fixed on the shadowy trees ahead. The man felt a strange pull, a whisper of curiosity that made his heart beat just a little faster. What was out there? Was it just a squirrel, or maybe a deer? Or was it something more? As if on cue, the dog let out a single bark and bolted forward, nearly pulling the leash out of the man's hand. He stumbled, caught off guard, and then followed, laughing nervously. "What's gotten into you today?" he asked, half joking, but there was a flicker of unease in his voice. They ventured deeper into the woods, farther than they'd ever gone before. The familiar trails disappeared behind them, replaced by twisting paths that seemed to lead nowhere. The dog was relentless, his nose to the ground, his pace quick and determined. It was as if he was following a scent, one the man couldn't detect but was impossible for the dog to ignore. The air grew cooler, and the sunlight filtering through the trees took on an eerie, golden hue. The man began to wonder if they should turn back, but every time he hesitated, the dog would look back at him with eyes that seemed to say, "Trust me." And so, he kept going. Finally, they came to a small clearing where the ground was covered in soft moss, and the air smelled of earth and something faintly sweet, like wildflowers. In the center of the clearing stood an old, weathered bench one the man swore he'd never seen before. It seemed out of place, as though it didn't belong there, and yet it felt inviting, almost as if it were waiting for them. The dog circled the bench, sniffing eagerly, his tail wagging in excitement. The man hesitated for a moment before sitting down, letting out a deep sigh. He looked around, half expecting to see another hiker or a sign of civilization, but there was nothing. Just silence, the rustle of leaves in the wind, and the soft panting of his dog. And then it happened. The dog barked sharply, drawing the man's attention to a spot just beyond the clearing. At first, he saw nothing, but then a glint of something metallic caught his eye. He stood up, his heart pounding, and took a few cautious steps forward. What he saw made him stop in his tracks. It was a box, small and unassuming, half buried in the dirt. The dog pawed at it excitedly, wagging his tail as if he just uncovered the greatest treasure in the world. The man bent down, brushing away the dirt with his hands, his curiosity now a roaring flame. "What is this?" he whispered to himself. He lifted the box, feeling its surprising weight, and noticed that it was locked. The lock was old and rusty, but the craftsmanship was intricate, almost beautiful. The man's mind raced with possibilities. Could it be someone's lost keepsake? A time capsule? Or was it something darker, something better left untouched? He looked at his dog, who was now sitting patiently, his head tilted as if waiting for the next move. The man chuckled nervously. "Well, buddy, looks like you've found something interesting." But as he held the box, a strange sensation washed over him. It wasn't fear exactly, but a deep, unshakable feeling that whatever was inside could change everything. He glanced around the clearing one last time, half expecting someone to emerge from the shadows and claim the box, but they were alone. For now. With a mix of excitement and trepidation, he decided to take the box home. He didn't know it yet, but this moment was the beginning of something far bigger than he could have imagined. A journey that would test his courage, his loyalty, and the unbreakable bond he shared with his dog. What lay inside the box? And what would it mean for their quiet, predictable lives? As they left the clearing and headed back toward the familiar, the man couldn't shake the feeling that they had just stepped into a story that was only beginning. As they emerged from the woods, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows over the town. The man couldn't help but feel a strange weight in his chest, a combination of excitement and unease that grew heavier with each step. The box, now carefully wrapped in his jacket, felt heavier too, as though it carried more than just its physical mass. His dog trotted beside him, tail wagging with the satisfaction of a mission accomplished, oblivious to the questions swirling in his owner's mind. Back at home, the man placed the box on the kitchen table. The dog sat nearby, watching intently as if he, too, was eager to uncover the secret they had stumbled upon. For a moment, the man just stared at the box. It wasn't particularly large, but it had a presence, a strange, almost magnetic pull that made it impossible to ignore. The intricate lock was unlike anything he'd ever seen, with delicate engravings that seemed to form a pattern, though he couldn't quite decipher it. He ran his fingers over the smooth surface of the box, wondering who it might have belonged to and why it had been left in such an unusual place. There were no markings or clues on the outside, just the lock, which now seemed like a challenge he wasn't sure he wanted to accept. He leaned back in his chair and sighed, glancing at his dog. "What do you think, boy? Should we open it?" The dog tilted his head, his ears perking up at the sound of his voice. It was almost as if he understood, as if he was encouraging his owner to take the next step. But something held the man back. It wasn't fear exactly, but a nagging sense that once the box was opened, there would be no turning back. For the rest of the evening, the man went about his usual routine, trying to push the box from his mind. He cooked dinner, played fetch with the dog in the yard, and even attempted to watch a movie. But no matter what he did, his thoughts kept drifting back to the mysterious find sitting on his kitchen table. When night fell, the house grew quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves outside and the rhythmic ticking of the clock. The man lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. The box seemed to be calling to him, its presence impossible to ignore. Finally, he gave in. He slipped out of bed, careful not to wake the dog, and crept into the kitchen. The box was still there, just as he'd left it, but now, in the dim light of the room, it seemed almost alive. He sat down and examined it again, this time noticing details he had overlooked before. The engravings on the lock weren't just decorative, they formed symbols, though he didn't recognize them. They seemed ancient, almost otherworldly, and the more he looked at them, the more his curiosity grew. He reached for his phone, intending to search online for anything similar, but his fingers hesitated over the screen. Would it even be wise to share this with anyone? What if the box contained something valuable, or worse, something dangerous? He set the phone down and leaned back, rubbing his temples. The dog padded into the kitchen, his nails clicking softly against the floor. He sat beside his owner and rested his head on the man's knee, his warm eyes filled with quiet concern. The man chuckled softly, grateful for the comforting presence of his loyal companion. "You really won't let me figure this out alone, huh?" he said, scratching behind the dog's ears. That night, the man dreamt of the woods. In his dream, the clearing was darker, and the bench was gone, replaced by a swirling mist that seemed to come alive. He saw shadows moving within the mist, shapes that were both human and not. The box was there too, sitting in the center of the clearing, glowing faintly. As he approached, the shadows turned toward him, their faceless forms watching silently. He woke up in a cold sweat, his heart pounding. Morning came, bringing with it a sense of urgency. He couldn't ignore the box any longer. After a quick breakfast and a reassuring pat on the dog's head, he decided to take it to a local locksmith. Maybe someone with experience in old locks could help him open it. The locksmith's shop was small and cluttered, filled with the smell of metal and oil. The man hesitated as he placed the box on the counter, watching the locksmith's expression closely. The older man adjusted his glasses and examined the box with a mix of curiosity and caution. "Where'd you find this?" the locksmith asked, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. "In the woods," the man replied, choosing his words carefully. "It was half buried near a trail." "Do you think you can open it?" The locksmith frowned, running his fingers over the lock. "This is old. Really old. I've seen a lot of locks in my time, but nothing quite like this." He glanced up at the man. "Are you sure you want to open it? Sometimes things are locked for a reason." The man hesitated, the locksmith's words echoing his own thoughts. But his curiosity outweighed his caution. "Yes," he said firmly. "I need to know what's inside." The locksmith nodded and set to work. Minutes turned into an hour as he tried different tools and techniques, muttering to himself under his breath. The man watched nervously, his dog lying at his feet, seemingly unconcerned by the tension in the room. Finally, the locksmith stepped back, wiping his brow. "I've done what I can. The rest is up to you." He handed the man a small key, one he had crafted to fit the intricate lock. "Be careful," he added, his voice low. "Whatever's in there, it's been kept hidden for a long time." The man thanked him and left the shop, the key clutched tightly in his hand. As he walked back home, his mind raced with possibilities. What would he find inside? And why did the locksmith's warning feel so ominous? Back at home, he sat at the kitchen table once more, the box and key in front of him. His dog sat nearby, watching intently as if sensing the gravity of the moment. The man took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly as he inserted the key into the lock. It turned with a soft click, and the lid creaked open. But before he could see what was inside, the power in the house flickered, plunging the room into darkness. He froze, his heart pounding, as the dog let out a low growl. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. And then, from somewhere deep within the box, a faint, glowing light began to emerge. The light from the box pulsed gently, casting eerie shadows on the walls of the dimly lit kitchen. The man leaned back in his chair, momentarily unsure if he should even look inside. His dog barked once, a sharp, alert sound that broke the heavy silence. Taking a deep breath, the man peered cautiously into the box. Inside, he saw what appeared to be a bundle of papers, yellowed with age and tied together with a frayed ribbon. Resting on top was a small object, something metallic that reflected the soft glow. He reached in carefully, his fingers brushing against the cold surface. When he lifted it out, he realized it was an old-fashioned pocket watch. The intricate engravings on its cover matched the symbols etched into the lock. The watch felt oddly warm in his hand, as though it was alive. Turning it over, he noticed something etched on the back, numbers that appeared to be coordinates. He stared at them, his mind racing. Why would someone lock away a pocket watch with coordinates on it? And what could be so important about the location it pointed to? He untied the ribbon and unfolded the papers beneath it. The handwriting was delicate and looping, but parts of it were smudged and difficult to read. As he scanned the first page, certain phrases stood out, mentions of hidden truths, unimaginable power, and a duty to protect. The more he read, the more uneasy he felt. The letter seemed to be a warning, though the exact nature of the danger was unclear. He stood abruptly, pacing the room while the dog followed his every move. The box, the watch, the papers, it all felt like pieces of a puzzle he didn't know how to solve. His logical side told him to put everything back, forget about it, and move on. But a deeper part of him, the part that had driven him to unearth the box in the first place, refused to let go. By the time the sun rose, he had made up his mind. He couldn't ignore the coordinates, not when the pull of the unknown was so strong. Grabbing a map and his phone, he began plotting the location. It was hours away, in a remote part of the countryside. The dog watched him closely as he packed a small bag, wagging his tail excitedly when he realized they were heading out. The drive was long and quiet, the landscape shifting from familiar suburbs to wide open fields and dense forests. As they neared the location, the air seemed to grow heavier, as if the very atmosphere was charged with something unseen. The road narrowed into a gravel path, and eventually, he had to park and continue on foot. The dog led the way, his nose to the ground as they navigated the overgrown trail. The man couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, though every time he turned around, there was nothing there. The forest grew denser, the trees twisting together like silent sentinels guarding a secret. Finally, they reached a clearing. At its center stood an ancient stone structure, partially covered in moss and vines. It looked like a small temple or shrine, its crumbling walls adorned with the same symbols as the box and the watch. The man hesitated at the edge of the clearing, his heart pounding. The place felt both sacred and foreboding, as though stepping closer would awaken something best left undisturbed. The dog, however, had no such reservations. He trotted straight to the entrance, sniffing around before barking sharply. The man followed reluctantly, his steps slow and deliberate. Inside, the air was cool and damp, carrying the faint scent of earth and decay. At the center of the structure was a pedestal, and on it rested another box identical to the one he had found in the woods. But this one was open, its contents long gone. Scattered around the pedestal were remnants of what looked like old tools and charred pieces of wood, as though someone had tried and failed to destroy whatever had been inside. The man's pulse quickened as he realized the implications. He wasn't the first person to come here. Someone else had found this place, opened the box, and taken whatever was inside. But who? And why? He examined the pedestal more closely, noticing faint carvings around its base. The symbols seemed to tell a story, one of guardians and seekers, of treasures that could either protect or destroy depending on who wielded them. He felt a chill run down his spine as he realized that the watch in his pocket might be part of this larger narrative. The dog barked again, this time more urgently. The man turned to see his companion standing near a wall, pawing at the ground. Kneeling beside him, he discovered a small, hidden compartment. It took some effort, but he managed to pry it open, revealing a hidden passage that led deep underground. The air inside the passage was colder, and the faint sound of dripping water echoed from somewhere below. The man hesitated, the weight of the watch in his pocket serving as a reminder of the risks he was taking. But his curiosity wouldn't let him turn back. With his dog at his side, he descended into the darkness, each step feeling like a leap into the unknown. As they moved deeper, the passage began to widen, revealing what appeared to be an underground chamber. The walls were lined with more carvings, and at the center of the room stood a large, circular platform. On it was another artifact, glowing faintly in the dim light. But before he could approach it, a sudden noise from behind made him freeze. Turning, he saw the faint outline of a figure standing at the entrance to the chamber. The figure didn't move, but its presence filled the space with an undeniable tension. The man's heart raced as he tried to decide what to do next. His dog growled low and steady, standing protectively in front of him. The figure remained silent, its form barely visible in the shadows. And then, as if to break the stalemate, The artifact on the platform began to hum softly, its glow intensifying. The man realized with a sinking feeling that whatever he had stumbled upon, it was far bigger and far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. The humming from the artifact grew louder, filling the chamber with a strange vibration that seemed to resonate in the very bones of the man and his dog. The figure in the shadows still hadn't moved, its presence like a weight pressing down on the air. The man's thoughts raced, trying to make sense of everything. The watch, the symbols, the warnings in the letter, was this the moment it had all been leading to? He gripped the pocket watch tightly in his hand, feeling its warmth intensify. As if in response, the artifact's glow flickered, its pulsing rhythm seeming to match the frantic beating of his heart. The dog barked sharply, breaking the silence, and the figure finally stirred, stepping closer. The faint light from the artifact revealed the features of a man, weathered and stern, his eyes locked on the watch. "You shouldn't have come here," the stranger said, his voice low but firm. The man stepped back instinctively, his dog growling defensively at his side. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice echoing in the chamber. "What is this place? What does all of this mean?" The stranger didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced at the artifact, his expression a mix of awe and caution. "You've touched something you don't understand," he finally said. "That watch you carry, it's more than an heirloom. It's a key. A key to something that should have stayed buried." The words sent a chill down the man's spine. "What is it unlocking?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The stranger's gaze hardened. "Power," he said simply. "Power that can reshape everything you know. But it's not meant for you or anyone." The man's grip on the watch tightened. "Then why leave it behind? Why make it possible for someone to find it?" The stranger sighed, his shoulders sagging as though under the weight of a heavy burden. "It wasn't meant to be found. The guardians who created this, they underestimated human curiosity. And greed." He stepped closer, his tone growing more urgent. "You need to leave. Now. Before it's too late." But before the man could respond, the artifact's glow flared brighter, and the humming rose to a deafening pitch. The ground beneath their feet trembled, dust and loose stones falling from the ceiling. The dog barked furiously, darting back and forth as if sensing danger. The stranger cursed under his breath, his eyes darting around the chamber. "It's activating," he said grimly. "You've awakened it." The man felt a surge of panic. "What does that mean? What's going to happen?" The stranger didn't answer. Instead, he lunged toward the artifact, his movements quick and deliberate. But as he reached out to touch it, a shockwave of energy burst forth, knocking him backward and sending the man and his dog tumbling to the ground. The artifact's glow was blinding now, the humming replaced by a low, otherworldly tone that seemed to reverberate through the chamber. The man scrambled to his feet, shielding his eyes as he tried to make sense of the chaos. The stranger lay motionless on the ground, and for a terrifying moment, the man thought he was dead. But then the figure stirred, groaning as he pushed himself up. "You don't understand what you've done," the stranger said, his voice strained. "That artifact, it's not just a key. It's a signal. And now, something is answering." The words sent a jolt of fear through the man. He looked around frantically, but the chamber was empty save for the three of them and the artifact. "What's coming?" he demanded. The stranger shook his head. "I don't know. But it won't be good." As if to confirm his words, the ground shook again, harder this time, and the air grew thick with an oppressive energy. The dog whined, pressing close to his owner, as though seeking protection. The man felt a surge of desperation. He didn't know what to do, how to stop whatever was happening. In his pocket, the watch grew unbearably hot, forcing him to pull it out. The moment it was in his hand, the artifact's glow seemed to react, its light shifting and intensifying. The stranger's eyes widened as he saw the watch. "Don't," he shouted. "Don't bring it any closer." But it was too late. The watch seemed to have a will of its own, pulling toward the artifact as though drawn by an invisible force. The man tried to resist, but his grip faltered, and the watch slipped from his hand, clattering onto the platform beside the glowing object. The moment the two touched, the chamber was engulfed in a blinding light. The man cried out, covering his eyes, while the dog barked in alarm. When the light finally dimmed, the artifact and the watch were gone. In their place was a swirling vortex of energy, its edges crackling with raw power. The stranger stared at it in horror. "You've opened the gateway," he said, his voice barely audible. The man's heart pounded as he took a step back, the reality of what he had done sinking in. The vortex pulsed ominously, and from its depths came a sound low, guttural, and filled with menace. The dog growled, his body tense as he faced the swirling mass. "What's going to happen now?" the man asked, his voice trembling. The stranger didn't answer. He simply stood there, staring at the vortex as though it held the answer to a question he'd spent his entire life trying to avoid. The chamber grew colder, the air thick with tension. The sound from the vortex grew louder, more distinct, and the man realized with a sinking feeling that it wasn't just noise. It was a voice deep and otherworldly, speaking in a language he couldn't understand. The dog barked again, his hackles raised, and the man felt an overwhelming urge to run. But there was nowhere to go. The vortex was expanding, its energy filling the room and leaving no space to escape. The man looked at the stranger, desperation in his eyes. "How do we stop this?" The stranger met his gaze, his expression grim. "We can't," he said. "Not anymore." And with that, the vortex surged, its energy spilling outward as the voice grew louder, its words echoing in the man's mind like a dark promise. The air felt electric, as though charged with an unseen force that pressed against the man's chest and made it hard to breathe. The vortex pulsed, radiating a light so bright it painted the chamber in stark, shifting shadows. The voice, deep, resonant, and otherworldly, grew clearer with every word, though its meaning remained an enigma. The man's dog barked furiously, the sound barely audible over the ominous hum filling the space. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the noise ceased. The vortex shrank into itself, its brightness fading until it was no more than a faint shimmer suspended in the air. The silence that followed was oppressive. Every sound magnified: the dog's panting, the man's labored breaths, the faint trickle of water somewhere deep within the cavern. "What just happened?" the man asked, his voice trembling as he looked to the stranger. The stranger didn't respond immediately. His face was pale, his eyes fixed on the space where the vortex had been, as though he feared it might return at any moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and heavy with dread. "It's not over." This was only the beginning. Before the man could press him for answers, the faint shimmer in the air began to change, its shape shifting as though something was struggling to emerge. The light twisted and distorted, and within moments, a figure stepped through, a tall, cloaked being whose presence filled the chamber with an icy chill. The man froze, his instincts screaming at him to run, but his legs refused to move. The dog growled low in its throat, standing protectively in front of him. The cloaked figure tilted its head as though studying them, its face obscured by shadows. "You've brought this upon yourselves," it said, its voice an unsettling blend of tones, as though multiple beings were speaking at once. The gateway was sealed for a reason. The man felt a surge of fear and guilt. "I didn't mean to." The figure raised a hand, silencing him. "Intentions are irrelevant. The barrier between worlds is fragile, and your actions have weakened it. Now, the balance is at risk." The stranger stepped forward, his posture tense. "I tried to stop him," he said, his voice laced with urgency. "There's still time to fix this, isn't there?" The figure's gaze shifted to him, and for a moment, the air grew colder. Time is fleeting, it said. And the forces that have been unleashed will not wait. Already they stir. The man glanced at the stranger, his mind racing. What forces? What are we dealing with? The figure turned back to him, its presence more oppressive with every passing second. They are ancient and relentless, it said. And once they awaken fully, nothing in your world will be spared. As if on cue, the chamber trembled again, the vibrations more intense than before. Small rocks dislodged from the ceiling, and the dog barked sharply, its instincts warning of imminent danger. The man's heart pounded as he looked around, trying to find a way out. But the figure raised a hand, and the trembling stopped. There is a way, it said, its tone somber. But it will demand great sacrifice. The man felt a surge of hope and dread in equal measure. What kind of sacrifice? The figure didn't answer directly. Instead, it pointed to the watch, now lying on the ground where the artifact had been. The key can still close the gateway, it said. But only if it is returned to its rightful place and its power extinguished. The stranger's eyes widened in realization. You mean it has to be destroyed, he said. The figure nodded. But to do so is no simple task. The watch is bound to the one who wields it. To sever that bond requires more than courage. It requires surrender. The man swallowed hard, the weight of the words sinking in. Surrender of what? He asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. The figure's gaze bore into him. Of everything. The chamber fell silent again, the enormity of the decision hanging in the air. The man looked at the watch, its surface still faintly glowing, and felt a pang of longing. It was all he had left of his father, a connection to a past that felt so distant now. Could he really let it go? The dog nudged his leg, breaking his thoughts. Its eyes were filled with trust, as if telling him that whatever he chose, they would face it together. But before he could decide, the chamber shook violently, more forcefully than before. A deep rumble echoed through the space, and from the shadows emerged another figure, this one more monstrous, its form twisting and shifting as though it couldn't quite stay solid. The cloaked figure stepped back, its voice sharp. It's too late. They've begun to break through. The man's fear turned to panic as the monstrous figure lunged forward, its form shifting and expanding as it moved. The dog barked furiously, leaping at the creature to protect its owner. The man tried to pull the dog back, but it was too quick, its bravery outweighing its size. The stranger grabbed the man's arm, pulling him toward the exit. We have to go, he shouted. But the man hesitated, his eyes fixed on the dog. I can't leave him. The cloaked figure raised its hands, summoning a barrier of light that momentarily held the monstrous being at bay. Decide quickly, it said. The gateway will not hold for long. The man's mind raced. He had to find a way to save his dog, to stop whatever forces were being unleashed, and to make sense of the impossible choices laid before him. But time was slipping away, and the weight of the decision pressed down on him like never before. The monstrous figure's roar echoed through the chamber, a sound so primal and raw it felt as though the very air quivered with fear. The man tightened his grip on the watch, its faint glow pulsing in rhythm with his racing heartbeat. His dog, undeterred by the overwhelming odds, stood firm, growling low and steady, a fearless protector ready to face whatever came next. The cloaked figure's barrier of light flickered under the force of the creature's relentless attacks. Cracks of darkness spiderwebbed across the shimmering shield, threatening to shatter it at any moment. The stranger pulled the man closer, urgency etched into every movement. If you don't act now, there won't be another chance. The man stared at the watch in his palm, feeling its strange warmth seep into his skin. This was at the moment he had been dreading and preparing for in equal measure. The figure had said the watch's destruction required surrender, but he didn't fully understand what that meant until now. It wasn't just about giving up the artifact, it was about relinquishing the part of him that still clung to the past. His father's voice echoed in his memory, reminding him of simpler times, of shared laughter and lessons learned. The watch wasn't just an object, it was a symbol of that bond. To let it go felt like losing his father all over again. But then he looked at his dog, who had stood by his side through every step of this strange journey, and he realized the truth. His father would have wanted him to protect what mattered most in the present, not cling to what had already passed. The monstrous figure broke through the barrier with a deafening crash, its shadowy tendrils snaking toward them. The cloaked figure stepped forward, raising its hands to summon another burst of light, but the effort visibly drained it. "Do it now!" the figure commanded, its voice trembling under the strain. With a deep breath, the man placed the watch on the ground. He knelt beside it, his dog at his side, and whispered a quiet goodbye. Then, with all the strength he could muster, he raised a nearby shard of rock and brought it down on the watch. The instant the watch shattered, the cavern was engulfed in a blinding light. The monstrous figure let out a guttural howl, its form unraveling as the light consumed it. The chamber trembled violently, and for a moment, it felt as though the very ground beneath them might give way. But then, as quickly as it had started, the chaos subsided. The light faded, the trembling stopped, and the cavern fell into an eerie stillness. The man opened his eyes, half expecting to see the world completely changed, but instead, he found himself back at the forest clearing where the journey had begun. His dog was beside him, panting but unharmed, and the stranger stood a few feet away, staring at the now empty space where the cavern had been. The cloaked figure was gone, leaving behind only a faint shimmer in the air. "Is it over?" the man asked, his voice shaky. The stranger nodded slowly, though his expression was far from relieved. "For now," he said. "But the balance has been restored at a cost." The man looked down at his hands, expecting to feel emptiness where the watch had been. Instead, he felt a strange warmth, and when he looked closer, he saw a faint mark on his palm, a glowing symbol that seemed to pulse with its own quiet energy. "What is this?" he asked, holding up his hand. The stranger's face darkened. "A reminder," he said. "The watch may be gone, but its power isn't. It's part of you now, whether you wanted it or not." Before the man could fully process the words, the dog let out a soft bark, drawing his attention. The forest around them seemed different. The air was heavier, the colors more vivid, as though the world itself had shifted slightly out of alignment. And then he saw it, a faint ripple in the air, like a distortion in glass. It hovered just beyond the tree-line, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably there. The stranger followed his gaze, his expression grim. "The gateway may be closed, but cracks remain," he said. "And those cracks will draw attention from things you can't even begin to imagine." The man felt a chill run down his spine. "What do we do now?" The stranger gave him a long, measured look. "You prepare," he said. "Because this isn't the end. It's only the beginning." As the stranger disappeared into the shadows of the forest, the man stood in silence, his dog pressed against his side. He didn't know what lay ahead, but one thing was certain: the life he had known was gone. In its place was a new, uncertain path, one filled with dangers and mysteries he had yet to comprehend. But as he looked at his dog, tail wagging despite the tension in the air, he felt a spark of determination. Whatever came next, they would face it together. And no matter how dark the road ahead might be, he knew they would find their way. The forest felt quieter than it had ever been. Every step the man took seemed amplified in the stillness, each rustle of leaves or snap of a twig a stark reminder of the chaos that had unfolded just moments ago. His dog trotted ahead, ears perked, occasionally glancing back as if to reassure him that they were still together. The stranger's words lingered heavily in his mind. Cracks remained. The watch's power wasn't truly gone but had instead become part of him. He flexed his fingers, staring at the faint mark on his palm that glowed softly in the dim light. It felt alien and yet familiar, as though it had always been there, waiting for the right moment to emerge. As they walked, he tried to make sense of it all. What had started as an ordinary day, a routine hike with his loyal companion, had turned into something so extraordinary it was almost impossible to believe. Yet the mark on his palm, the eerie changes in the forest, and the vivid memories of the creature and the cavern were undeniable proof. The trail eventually led them back to the edge of the forest, where the golden hues of a late afternoon sun painted the sky. The familiar sight of his truck parked just beyond the trees brought an odd mix of relief and unease. It was strange how normal everything looked now, as if the forest had decided to tuck away its secrets once more, leaving him to wonder if it had all been some elaborate dream. His dog bounded ahead, tail wagging, and leapt into the truck's open bed, settling into his usual spot. The man paused for a moment, taking one last look at the forest. It felt different now, not threatening, but alive in a way he hadn't noticed before. The trees seemed taller, their roots deeper, their presence heavier. He couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was watching him, as though it had become a silent guardian, keeping an eye on the mark that now bound him to its mysteries. The drive home was uneventful, the hum of the engine and the soft wind through the open window a soothing contrast to the day's events. His dog rested in the back, occasionally sitting up to peer out at passing fields and hills. The man found himself glancing at his palm every so often, half expecting the mark to fade or disappear. But it didn't. It pulsed faintly, as though it were breathing along with him, a constant reminder that life as he knew it had changed. When they arrived home, the familiar creak of the porch steps and the soft glow of the porch light felt like a warm embrace. His dog darted inside eagerly, heading straight for the water bowl before flopping onto his favorite rug. The man followed, shutting the door behind him and letting out a long, heavy sigh. The weight of the day pressed down on him, and for the first time, he allowed himself to feel the exhaustion that had been building. He sat on the couch, his dog curling up beside him, and stared out the window at the darkening sky. Stars began to emerge, faint at first but growing brighter with each passing moment. He thought about his father, about the watch, and what it had symbolized. Letting go of it had been one of the hardest things he'd ever done, but it had also felt right. His father had always believed in him, always told him he was capable of more than he realized. Perhaps this was what he had meant. The mark on his palm warmed slightly, as if responding to his thoughts. He didn't fully understand what it meant or what it would demand of him in the future, but he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't afraid. He had faced the unknown and emerged stronger, not just because of the power now embedded in him, but because of the bond he shared with his dog, the stranger who had guided him, and even the forest itself. In the days that followed, life returned to a semblance of normalcy. He went back to his routine, taking long walks with his dog, tending to his small garden, and enjoying the quiet life he'd built. But the forest was never far from his mind. He often found himself wandering its edges, drawn to its depths in ways he couldn't quite explain. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, he felt a shift in the air. His dog, usually relaxed and carefree, suddenly perked up, ears twitching. The man followed his gaze and saw a faint ripple in the distance, like the one he had seen after destroying Watch. He didn't feel fear this time, only curiosity and resolve. Whatever lay ahead, he knew he wouldn't face it alone. With his dog by his side and the mark on his palm as a guide, he felt ready for whatever challenges the forest or the world beyond might bring. As he turned back toward home, the ripple faded into the twilight, leaving only the promise of new adventures and the quiet assurance that some stories don't truly end, they simply make way for the next chapter. And in that moment, he understood that the unexpected outcome of his journey wasn't just the power he had gained or the mysteries he had unraveled. It was the realization that life itself was an adventure, filled with twists and turns, challenges and triumphs, and that the greatest strength lay in embracing the unknown with an open heart.